September 10th in another terrorist attack by Russia. Russian missiles and drones attacked Poland. 4 key airports, Warsaw, Rzeszów, Lublin and Modlin, have been paralyzed. Explosions, panic, evacuation. Thousands of passengers are stranded on the ground. For the first time, Russian drones and missiles struck a residential building in Poland. Prime Minister Tusk urgently convened the government. This is not a provocation, this is an act of aggression. We will discuss all of this and NATO's response right now with renowned military analyst Roman Svitan.
Breaking news, friends, September 10th. This is sensational. Russia has attacked Poland. 1 missile and more than 30 Russian kamikaze drones attacked Polish airspace. 1 struck a house in the city of Wyroki, the others were shot down. 4 airports have been closed, Warsaw, Rzeszów, Lublin and Modlin. F-16s, F-35s and Nato reconnaissance aircraft have been scrambled. Polish military officials state that this is an act of aggression against a NATO country. We will discuss all of this with renowned military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. Wishing everyone good health.
Roman Grigorievich, today Europe woke up in panic because Russian missiles and drones violated the Polish border, penetrating more than 500 kilometers deep. In Warsaw, airports are paralyzed and thousands of Poles and passengers are stranded on the ground. Polish Prime Minister Tusk has convened an emergency government meeting. NATO Article 4, comprehensive consultations. This is actually the first time Russian drones have struck a residential building in Poland. The situation is unprecedented, but the most important question is NATO ready to respond? Roman Grigorievich, what do you think?
Well, it's unlikely that there was panic in Europe. Why? Because in Europe, the Poles, just a few days ago, as we discussed, put their air force and army on high alert, the so-called heightened readiness mode, and closed the borders with Belarus. These things don't just happen for no reason. At the very least, intelligence was at work. Few people talk about it, but such actions are never taken lightly or without cause. So there was certain intelligence data that was being shared among the alliance countries' intelligence groups regarding a possible strike on Poland, because it was specifically the Air Force that was put on high alert. So in essence, they were expecting this incursion. Well, we need to break things down. Afterwards, there really wasn't any panic as such. And the response, for example, to those same Russian German drones was immediate, because they really did scramble the F-16s and F-35s, and they engaged, at least with those targets that needed or could be engaged, based on the situation as it was unfolding at that moment. But the panic most likely was in Moscow. Why? Because everyone started running around with those so-called emergency suitcases for Putin. Because after he was informed that the B-52s had taken off and were heading toward Europe, well, at that point, they probably filled up their entire stock of suitcases. Now they're looking for new ones. That is, somewhere they're trying to order new ones to bring them in. So the panic is most likely there. The European and NATO response, well, there definitely has to be one. Yes, they have a certain action algorithm. First, Article 4 is triggered, and now they really will be holding consultations on how to respond to this. Well, I would call it an invasion. Why? Because it wasn't just 1 or 2 missiles that entered, let's say, but 24 or more than 24 flying objects entered the airspace of a NATO country and naturally landed on the ground. That is, well, some were shot down, some just landed for various reasons. So here, it's definitely not a provocation anymore. This is already an invasion. How the NATO generals will react to this, or how, for example, the Russians will acknowledge this invasion, but at the very least, there's already a reaction from the ambassadors who have been pulled in. It wasn't me, and I have nothing to do with it. That's pretty much how the Russians are playing dumb, just like they always do. In fact, as I see it, they're basically born at the full gas station. They get it stamped on them, and they never shake it off for the rest of their lives. Why? Because, well, this invasion is just too obvious, way too obvious. And from the territory of Belarus, from the territory of Ukraine, Russian drones came in, at least 1 missile as well. In other words, they accomplished, as they say, their combat mission. The question is, where did this mission come from? From the same place the mission to attack Ukraine in 2022 came from, China. So in 2022, Putin went to see Xi Jinping. They had their little rendezvous, naturally rubbed shoulders. A spark flew, as they say, and they decided to attack Europe by attacking Ukraine. And naturally, back in 2022, Xi Jinping sent his mad dog Putin to bite Europe, starting with Ukraine. Now it's the same story. Once again, they rubbed shoulders at the parade in China and on the highway in China. And once again, Xi Jinping sent Putin ahead. well, maybe it's time to bite NATO now. Why? Because they don't seem to be reacting much to the strikes on Ukraine. They've hit Ukraine this way and that, killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, killing children and the elderly together with Putin, and still there's no reaction. So maybe it's time to go after NATO. And now they've already started going after NATO. Before that, there was the Mi-8 incursion into Estonia. It flew around for 4 minutes, checked things out, no one reacted at all. Naturally, now combat drones have already started flying, this time over Poland. So now, well, we're waiting for NATO's response. Again, what about us? Should we cut off our own? Should we go to war with Russia? So let the Europeans, the NATO members, decide for themselves what to do about it. Well, like I said, if they're born fools, they'll die fools. In other words, there are no other options. And the fact that the B-52s have taken off and are carrying out a certain, again, the same plan, the same action algorithm in case of an incursion, these are already actions in response to an incursion, because why do the B-52s take off? For striking the enemy with nuclear weapons. Well, what else are B-52s for? Again, they take off empty. Then they land at several bases in Europe. There are at least 5 US bases in Europe where nuclear weapons are already stored. In Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and Turkey. These are American bases where B-52s can land, load up with nuclear weapons, and then proceed according to their assigned missions. And look at Putin now. In the near future, he'll be quieter than water, lower than grass, squirming in a place that Kabaeva probably never gave him. He really shouldn't have it. He'll be squirming, fussing over those little suitcases, then filling them up again, then fussing over them once more. So it's a cycle because they won't bring in any extras. They simply won't have time, at least while those B-52s are stationed in Europe.
Roman Grigorievich, that's very interesting information. Just last night, a message appeared in one of the Telegram channels claiming that during the downing of drones, a NATO aircraft was allegedly damaged. How likely is it that this information is true?
Well, it definitely depends on what was used to shoot them down. For example, if they used missiles, well, mostly they use AIM-9s. So if, say, a missile locks on, it's a heat-seeking homing head. It takes down the target at a considerable distance, several kilometers away from the aircraft. But if they used cannons here, yes, then when approaching the drone, naturally during its destruction, the aircraft could get hit by debris. That's actually the danger of using cannons and getting close to Russian drones. In this sense, of course, it's optimal to use missiles at a greater distance. Although there are certain factors, for example, related to the drone's flight altitude, if they're flying at extremely low altitudes, it's very difficult against the background of the ground. Well, although their radars are actually pretty good, the missile might not be able to lock on. That is, the missile might fail to acquire the target, and then the pilot comes closer and starts shooting at the drone with the cannon, and that's at close range. That is, it's just over a kilometer away. So naturally, at high speeds, a fighter jet can't fly the way a drone does. The drone flies slowly, about 150 to 200 kilometers per hour. A fighter jet, well, its speed should be at least around 400 to 600 kilometers per hour. At speeds below 300 kilometers per hour, it simply stalls. No one is going to go on a combat mission with flaps, slats, or other wing mechanisms deployed. So basically, there are these kinds of difficulties that could definitely have damaged the aircraft. By the way, we didn't just damage one plane. We actually lost an aircraft under almost the exact same circumstances when our pilots ended up in the path of shrapnel after the explosion of a detonated, or rather destroyed, drone.
Roman Grigorievich, now let's move on to our attacks. Ukrainian drones attacked Adler in Sochi. Locals are reporting a powerful explosion. According to the governor of Rzeszów, there are reportedly serious damages. Moreover, it was reported that at that moment, the president of Russia, dictator Putin, was in Sochi. What do you think, Roman Grigorievich?
Well, most likely this was still an attack on military targets in the direction of Novorossiysk. Why Sochi, Novorossiysk, Tuapse? These are exactly the locations that are important for us to target for destruction, because there is a powerful air defense system deployed there, which covers the ports of Novorossiysk and Tuapse. There are 2 ports there that serve as oil terminals capable of transshipping petroleum products, so there is a serious air defense system there, including in Sochi. That's why, most likely, the strike was aimed specifically at the enemy's radio technical troops. But at that moment, Putin's aircraft was there. Whether Putin himself was there, or it was his double, triple, or the plane just decided to fly back and forth, well, that's another question. It just happened to coincide like that. At that moment, one of the first aircraft of the Russian aerospace forces was present.
Roman Grigorievich, regarding the attack on Kuibyshev and Lysychansk, As a result of the explosion, another main oil pipeline, Kuibyshev-Lysychansk, in the Saratov region, was put out of operation in Russia, according to media reports citing sources in the security services. The pipeline, with a capacity of 82 million tons per year, supplied fuel to the Russian army. What do you think?
Well, it was originally an oil pipeline. The thing is, there's an oil refinery in Lysychansk. Just outside Lysychansk, there's an oil processing plant literally nearby, about 10 kilometers west of Lysychansk. The Russians now, well, it's destroyed, and the Russians finished it off when they were advancing from Stara, that is, from Severodonetsk to Lysychansk across the Siversky Donets and further on. They practically destroyed this Lysychansk oil refinery. It's not operational and most likely won't be again. So at one time there was an oil pipeline leading to it, so-called. So now, since the Russians have nowhere to dump the oil, Lysychansk isn't working, they've turned this oil pipeline into a product pipeline and they're pumping diesel through it. That's exactly right. Diesel is being supplied there for the Russian army, for Russian tanks, for Russian equipment, for their movements. It was very important for us to destroy or at least damage this product pipeline in order to ensure the safety of our troops on the line of contact, among other things. That is proper competent task setting and then execution. By the way, recently there have been a lot of strikes specifically on oil pipelines, product pipelines, and gas pipelines. So we can see a systematic effort targeting Russia's oil sector, the oil and gas industry. This is what we've been talking about for several years, Dasha. Well, so finally, the main thing is just not to stop now.
Roman Grigorievich, you see, the question is, what capabilities does Russia have today to carry out missile and drone terror? Because right now, every night, Russia is attacking Ukraine with ballistic missiles, rockets, and drones in huge numbers. Every night.
Well, they say, after all, there is a war going on. In the course of hostilities, this is standard practice, using strike weapons against each other. It's a question of quantity, a question of targets. As for the Russians, their targets are mostly, well, as we can see, this is pure genocide. In other words, it's terrorism. There was a strike on one of our villages. We lost more than 20 people, lost them 8 kilometers from the line of contact when pensions were being distributed. So it was a strike specifically targeting the elderly, pensioners. Only the Russians are capable of this, because even animals don't do such things. Only the Russians are capable of this. It's their psychomatrix. It's ingrained in them since childhood. I've said it so many times about these fools. This is a real problem among Russians. In other words, their objectives are genocidal, while ours are naturally to carry out combat missions and pursue strictly military goals. Why? Because, first of all, even we don't have enough resources to spread our attention thin. In other words, the amount of ammunition we have, produce or receive, isn't even enough to meet our military objectives. That's why our priority is, these are legitimate military targets. But for the Russians, their current priority is genocidal strikes, to force Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian army to capitulate on Russian terms. That's obvious. Everyone understands this perfectly well. These terms have already been laid out at these so-called peace negotiations. Why does no one ever engage with terrorists? When a terrorist puts forward their demands, they then start killing hostages to force those demands to be met. I mean, this is the standard approach of terrorism. This is exactly what Russia is doing now. So you are absolutely right. In other words, the Russians will keep launching serious strikes against us every day. There are only two options to protect our country from these attacks. The first is air defense, a powerful layered air defense system, both frontal and rear, which is very important. The second is a mirror response, mirror strikes on decision-making centers. That is, as soon as something comes our way, everything should immediately be sent to Moscow. But in principle, only one type can break through to Moscow, ballistic missiles. And as for ballistics, instead of actual ballistic missiles, all we have are announcements from these green announcement factories and videos they've churned out over 6 years of rule, and nothing else. So until we get ballistic missiles, and we must have them after all, we are a rocket country. Well, we used to produce missiles that kept at least half the world in fear. So we are capable of producing these missiles. The issue is with the announcers. Well, these guys from the burnt out theater at the very least can't handle this task. That means they need to clear the way. I've said it so many times already, clear the way. If you can't properly set the task for the technical assignment and fund the production of ballistic missiles for Moscow, as soon as we have ballistic missiles like magic, the Russians will stop carrying out terrorist attacks on our country.
Ukraine needs at least 10 Patriot systems. Shmyhal made a statement following the 30th Ramstein meeting, securing $6 billion for the production of drones, including interceptor drones, FPVs, and strike drones. It is necessary to allocate $60 billion from the budgets of partner countries for 2026 to protect Europe and Ukraine. the delivery of an additional 10 Patriot systems, missiles for them, as well as SAM-T, NASAMS, IRIS-T, and Hawk systems. Tightening of sanctions, confiscation of frozen Russian assets. Roman Grigorievich, the floor is yours.
It was a good Ramstein, but it received little coverage in the information flow. Maybe that's for the best in a way. Why? Because, well, not everything needs to be broadcast, but what has already come out should have been amplified. An excellent Ramstein. And our partners, well, you can see the involvement of all the groups, those who can help us, for example, both financially and with combat components. You can really see the systematic work being done to supply our army with a sufficient amount of weaponry. Everyone here understands perfectly well. If we had intercepted those Russian drones at the eastern border, they wouldn't have reached Poland. Well, there is an understanding of these processes, and at the very least, it's going to get worse now. And I think we will actually receive even more than what this Ramstein has allocated to us. Mainly air defense systems. Yes, indeed, we need at least about 10 Patriots and realistically up to 50. That is, in order to at least cover the main areas where our civilian population is concentrated, plus infrastructure sites, we need up to 50 Patriots, but at a minimum 10. The question of their delivery, the question of generating them, so to speak, the movement itself, without the Americans, it won't work, because we need to clearly understand, beyond just the concept, who can actually organize this. Let me repeat, only the Americans can organize 10. Europe is not capable of this at the moment. So what is Europe doing? It tries to supplement our request with whatever it can provide itself. With the same IRIS-Ts, the same OUKs, by the way, in sufficient quantity, they're not bad. Even though these systems are 50 years old, they work quite well. So they're decent systems. Naturally, the same goes for SAM-Ts. Europe is sharing with us whatever it can provide, especially the Germans. In other words, Germany is transferring a fairly large number of air defense systems to us, sometimes even at their own expense, meaning they take them off active duty and hand some of their air defense systems over to us. It's a good move, understandable, but I'll repeat once again, without reciprocal strikes on Russian Moscow. Why not on the Russian Federation as a whole? 17 million square kilometers, we can't trample all of it, no matter how much we might want to, but we can trample Moscow. Slowly, we'll come down from the mountain and head into the Moscow herd of this Russian livestock.
Roman Grigorievich, what is your forecast for what will happen on the front lines before Christmas? Because right now, many European leaders are saying that Christmas will become another milestone, a negotiation track in the Russian-Ukrainian war, in Russia's aggression.
The Russians use any negotiation track, first of all, as we've already said, for terrorist purposes. They put forward the demand to kill hostages. That's one. Second, what else do they use this negotiation track for? In order to effectively prevent our partners, or rather to give our partners who genuinely don't really want to help us, and we do indeed have such individuals, as they commonly say, there's a black sheep in every family, those who absolutely don't want to help us, to give them some kind of compelling argument not to help us and to hold back those who might otherwise be willing to offer their assistance. This is the so-called negotiation trend. Why give anything to Ukraine, to Putin? He's already ready to stop the fighting, so let's help him with that by not giving Ukraine enough weapons. That's why the negotiation track is very important for Putin. Moreover, it's even more important to him for the purposes of what's called an operational pause, which for Putin should become apparent around December. In the last 3 or 4 months, he can go all in and completely burn through all his available reserves by throwing the entire Russian army into capturing additional territory. And then he will inevitably have to stop. And it's not just about stopping himself, but about stopping us from launching counterattacks. So he needs some kind of ironclad trump card, not the one sitting on Bankova, but a trump card in the negotiation process to stop us from counterattacking. And we can do that. He understands this perfectly well. That's why, as you rightly said, this so-called Christmas peace track will be used by Putin in 3 ways. Why do we even need this? What is it for us? We understand perfectly well what Putin wants. If he tries to stop just to take an operational pause, build up forces and resources, and then start the summer military campaign already in 2026. But for that, he needs some kind of peace track. That's why we shouldn't fall for all these provocations at the very least. We shouldn't even let them enter the information space. We need to push our own agenda. And right now, we have a good opportunity at this stage to grind down the entire second wave of the Russian offensive. But this opportunity exists. The current disposition of enemy forces and assets, the overall configuration of the front, is dangerous for us if our troop density is insufficient. And right now, it is insufficient. But if we reinforce our troops with enough personnel, then the configuration of the front will become dangerous for the Russians. They've launched breakthroughs everywhere. What is a breakthrough? It's when they push out somewhere like near Dobropilia, but they can't reinforce the flanks because they have nothing to do it with. And we don't let them do that. And almost everywhere, in 5 to 7 directions, they've managed to trample around somewhere over the summer. And now if we increase the pressure on the flanks, we can not only push them back, we can grind up this entire second wave. Bang. Somewhere around 150,000 to 200,000 Russians could go to Kobzon's concert, along with thousands of pieces of equipment they've brought in. But for that, I repeat, we need to reinforce the troops with personnel, meaning increase the density of troops and the density of fire. That's also very important. So we need additional resources, reserves, plus a sufficient amount of ammunition in order to accomplish this task. Once again, let me repeat, our situation at the front is not bad at the moment, even on the Eastern Front, given the current configuration, if only we have enough troops.
Dear audience, please like this video and write a few kind words in the comments to support the armed forces of Ukraine and Ukraine. Together with Roman Svitan, a well-known military analyst, we are working for audiences around the world so that they know the truth about Russian aggression. The well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Hryhorovich, thank you. And as always, see you this Friday.
Goodbye.